The old truck sputtered to a halt at the edge of the withering cornfield. James Harper wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted at the strange object glinting in the afternoon sun. He'd never seen anything like it before. A sleek black drone with an expensive camera, lying broken among his dying crops. As he carefully lifted it from the dirt, he had no idea that 50 miles away, Olivia Blackwood was watching him through a hidden backup camera, making notes about his gentle hands and thoughtful expression. He couldn't have known that this moment, this simple act of finding something lost, would pull him from the brink of financial ruin into a world he never imagined existed. He had just passed the first test. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive into this life-changing encounter between a struggling farmer and a billionaire's daughter with a secret mission. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on James Harper's shoulders as he surveyed his failing farm. At 42, the lines around his eyes had deepened not just from age, but from worry. 3 seasons of drought had turned what was once fertile land into a desperate situation. The bank was calling about the mortgage again, and the irrigation system needed repairs he couldn't afford. "Not much left to lose," he muttered, kicking at the dry soil that had supported generations of Harpers before him. His grandfather had built this place from nothing, his father had expanded it, and now James was watching it crumble in his hands. He'd sent the farmhands home early today. No point paying them to watch crops die. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of corn stalks barely clinging to life. James climbed back into his truck, intending to check the far field before calling it a day, when something caught his eye. A flash of metal where there shouldn't be one, about 100 yards into the cornfield. Curiosity pulled him from the truck. As he approached, the object became clearer, a sophisticated drone, one of those high-end models he'd seen on television but never in person. It lay partially buried in the dirt, one of its rotors bent at an unnatural angle. Its sleek black surface scratched but still impressive. "Well, what do we have here?" James crouched beside it, careful not to cause any additional damage. He'd always been good with machines, a necessity when you couldn't afford to call a professional every time something broke down on the farm. Gently, he turned the drone over, revealing a complex camera system underneath, and what appeared to be a custom build unlike any commercial model he recognized. He looked up at the cloudless sky, wondering where it had come from. There were no properties close enough where someone might have been flying it. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and he knew most folks there couldn't afford something this expensive. As he examined it more closely, he noticed a small insignia etched into the metal, a stylized BT inside a circle. It meant nothing to him, but maybe it would help identify the owner. What James didn't know was that 50 miles away, in a sleek glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline, Olivia Blackwood was watching him on a computer screen. 28 years old with an intensity that made most people uncomfortable, she leaned forward, studying the farmer's movements through the drone's backup camera, a feature unknown to most, activated only when the primary systems failed. "Found another one," she said, without turning from the screen. Behind her, a tall man with salt and pepper hair nodded. "Where did this one crash?" "Harper Farm, about 15 miles outside of Riverdale." Olivia's eyes never left the screen. "The owner's name is James Harper, 42 years old, third-generation farmer, no criminal record, divorced 4 years ago, no children." Her father, Richard Blackwood, approached the desk and glanced at the screen. "What's his financial situation?" "Dire," Olivia replied. 3 seasons of drought. The bank's about to foreclose. He's got about 3 months before he loses everything." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Perfect testing ground." Olivia finally looked up at her father. "You know, we could just interview people like normal companies. This whole drone testing thing seems excessive." Richard smiled, the expression softening his otherwise severe features. "People show their true character when they think no one is watching, Olivia. I've built Blackwood Tech on that principle. Interviews show you who people pretend to be, but these tests show you who they really are." Olivia turned back to the screen where James was carefully placing the drone in the back of his truck. "Let's see what Mr. Harper does with an expensive piece of technology that fell from the sky. Most people would sell it or keep it. And if he tries to return it? Richard asked. Then we move to phase 2, Olivia said. Back at the farm, James carried the drone into his workshop, a converted barn that housed his tools and served as a refuge when problems seemed insurmountable. He cleared a space on his workbench and set the drone down under the bright shop light. It was even more impressive up-close carbon fiber body, advanced stabilization system, and a camera that probably cost more than his truck. He found a screwdriver and began carefully removing the outer panels. James had always had a knack for fixing things. In another life, he might have been an engineer, but family tradition had placed him here, on this land, following in footsteps worn deep by generations before him. The internal components revealed themselves to be even more sophisticated than he'd expected. Custom circuit boards, proprietary connections, this wasn't something he could fully repair without specialized knowledge. But the physical damage seemed manageable. The bent rotor could be straightened, the scratched body cleaned up. As he worked, night fell outside. The barn's single window showed only darkness now, but James barely noticed. There was something soothing about focusing on a problem he might actually be able to solve, unlike the drought or the mortgage. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear the car approaching until headlights swept across the wall. James looked up, confused. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at nearly 10 o'clock at night. Wiping his hands on a rag, he stepped outside to see a sleek black sedan parked beside his weathered pickup truck. The contrast couldn't have been starker: luxury against utility, new against old. A woman emerged from the driver's side, her silhouette sharp against the car's headlights. "Can I help you?" James called, closing the barn door behind him. The woman approached, and as she stepped into the light spilling from the workshop windows, James saw she was younger than he'd expected, probably in her late 20s. She wore a simple black blazer over jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Despite the casual clothes, something about her posture and movement suggested money and confidence. "I hope so," she said, offering her hand. "I'm Olivia. I lost something today, and I'm trying to find it." James hesitated before shaking her hand, suddenly aware of his dirt-stained clothes and the grease under his fingernails. "James Harper. What did you lose?" "A drone," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "An experimental model I was testing for work. My tracking system indicated it went down somewhere in this area." James couldn't hide his surprise. "You're in luck. I found one this afternoon in my cornfield. It's pretty banged up, but I've been trying to fix it." Something flickered across Olivia's face: surprise, perhaps, or satisfaction. "You've been trying to fix it? I hope that's okay. I didn't know who it belonged to, but I figured someone would come looking for it eventually." He gestured toward the barn. "Would you like to see?" Olivia nodded, and James led her into the workshop. The drone sat on his workbench, partially disassembled, but with several components already repaired. Tools were arranged neatly around it, and detailed notes were scribbled on a pad beside it. "You've made a lot of progress," Olivia said, examining his work. There was genuine admiration in her voice. "I didn't touch the electronic components, much those are beyond me. But the physical damage wasn't too bad." James ran a hand through his hair, suddenly self-conscious about the modest workshop. "I like fixing things." Olivia picked up his notes, scanning the detailed observations he'd made about the drone's construction. "You have a good eye for detail. Comes with farming," James said with a shrug. "You learn to notice small changes in soil, in weather, in equipment. And you just decided to fix it, rather than sell it or keep it." The question seemed casual, but her eyes were sharp on his face. James frowned. "It's not mine to sell or keep. Someone made it, and they probably want it back." He gestured vaguely toward the drone. "That thing has a purpose, and it's not sitting in my barn." Olivia nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "I appreciate that perspective, Mr. Harper. Just James is fine. James." She smiled, and something about it transformed her face, making her seem younger, less formidable. "I work for Blackwood Tech. We're developing these drones for agricultural applications, actually. Crop monitoring, automated irrigation assessment, that sort of thing." James raised his eyebrows. Blackwood Tech? The company behind all those renewable energy projects? Among other things, yes. Olivia leaned against the workbench. We're expanding into agricultural technology, trying to develop systems that could help farmers deal with climate challenges more effectively. James gave a humorless laugh. You're about 3 seasons too late for this farm, but I wish you luck. Olivia's gaze traveled around the workshop, taking in the worn tools, the patched equipment, the calendar on the wall with bold red circles around payment due dates. How bad is it? The directness of the question took James by surprise. People in small farming communities didn't ask so bluntly about financial troubles. They knew without asking, or they pretended not to notice. Bad enough, he admitted after a moment. 3 seasons of drought, irrigation system failing, and the bank isn't interested in hearing about next season anymore. Olivia nodded thoughtfully. What if I offered you a job? James stared at her. A job? Blackwood Tech needs people who understand farming from practical experience, not just theory. People who can look at a broken drone and figure out how to fix it instead of writing it off. She gestured to his notes. People who pay attention to details. James shook his head, confused by the sudden turn in the conversation. I'm a farmer, Ms. Blackwood. Olivia Blackwood. She watched his face, waiting for recognition. It took a moment, but then it clicked. Blackwood? As in, Richard Blackwood is my father, yes. She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were a minor detail rather than a connection to one of the richest men in the country. James looked from Olivia to the drone and back again. The insignia BT. Blackwood Tech. I don't understand. Why would someone like you be out here in the middle of nowhere looking for a drone? Because it's not just any drone, Olivia explained. It's a prototype we've been developing for years. And because I prefer to handle important matters personally. The way she said it made James think there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he focused on her unexpected offer. What kind of job are we talking about? A consulting position, to start. You'd work with our development team, testing agricultural technology in real-world conditions. Olivia reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the workbench next to the drone. The pay would be considerably better than farming in a drought. James picked up the card, running his thumb over the embossed Logartha same BT that was on the drone. I can't just leave a farm. You wouldn't have to. At least not right away. Part of the job would involve implementing our systems here, turning your farm into a testing ground. Olivia's eyes met his. We could help with the irrigation issues as part of the arrangement. James looked around the workshop, at the tools that had belonged to his father, at the walls that had stood for generations. The offer seemed too good to be true, which in his experience meant it probably was. Why me? He asked finally. There must be thousands of farmers in trouble. Why offer this to someone you just met? Olivia smiled again, but this time there was something measured in it. Would you believe me if I said it was luck? Right place, right time? Not really, James admitted. Good answer. Olivia pushed away from the workbench. The truth is, Blackwood Tech has been conducting a search for the right partners for this project, people with the right combination of skills and character. And a broken drone told you I had those? You'd be surprised what we can learn about a person from how they handle finding something that doesn't belong to them. Olivia headed toward the door of the workshop. Think about the offer, James. Call me when you decide. James followed her outside, watching as she got back into the sleek sedan. How long do I have to decide? Olivia rolled down the window. The drone will be fully charged by tomorrow afternoon. I imagine you'll finish repairing it by then, given what I've seen of your work. Let me know your decision when you're done. With that cryptic response, she drove away, leaving James standing in the farmyard, the business card still in his hand, wondering what had just happened. When James returned to the workshop, he noticed something he'd missed before: a small red light on the drone's underside, blinking steadily. The backup camera was active, had been active all along. He'd been watched, tested. For some reason, this realization didn't anger him, as it might have once. Instead, he felt a strange sense of validation. He'd passed a test he didn't know he was taking. He sat down at the workbench and continued his repairs, working late into the night. By dawn, the drone was nearly restored, the bent rotor straightened, the body cleaned and polished. Only a few scratches remained as evidence of its crash. As the morning sun streamed through the workshop window, James finally stepped back, satisfied with his work. The drone looked almost new now, ready to take to the skies again. He placed it carefully on the workbench and went to the house to shower and change. Standing under the hot water, he allowed himself to consider Olivia's offer. Consulting for Blackwood Tech would mean a reliable income, something he hadn't had in years. It would mean working with cutting-edge technology instead of struggling with equipment that was decades old. Most importantly, it might mean saving the farm. But it would also mean change, and change had rarely been kind to James Harper. His marriage had ended when his ex-wife decided she couldn't bear another season of uncertainty, another year of watching the rain fail to come. Would this change be any different? After showering, James made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, looking out at the fields. The drought had turned what should have been vibrant green into a patchwork of brown and yellow. 3 generations of Harpers had worked this land, but none had faced the challenges he was facing now. The climate was changing, and farming had to change with it or die. Maybe that was what Blackwood Tech was offering, a chance to be part of that change instead of a victim of it. James reached for his phone and dialed the number on Olivia's card before he could second-guess himself. She answered on the second ring. "James," she said, not bothering with hello. "You've made a decision?" "I have questions first," he replied. "Real ones. Not whatever test you're running." There was a pause, and then a soft laugh. "Fair enough. Ask your questions. Is this real? A real job, real money, real help for the farm?" "Yes to all 3, Olivia said without hesitation. "We're prepared to offer you a 1-year contract to start, with an option to extend if the partnership proves fruitful. The salary would be $120,000, plus implementation costs." For the farm, James nearly dropped his coffee cup. That was more than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. "Why me?" he asked again. "And don't tell me it's because I found your drone. That can't be the whole story." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "My father has a theory about character," she said finally. "He believes that true innovation can only come from people who have both technical skill and moral integrity. The drone tests are his way of finding such people." "That seems like an elaborate way to recruit employees." "It's not just about employees, James. It's about partners. People we can trust with technology that could change the face of agriculture globally." Olivia's voice grew more animated. "The drones are just the beginning. We're developing irrigation systems that use a fraction of the water of conventional methods. Soil sensors that can predict problems before they affect crops. Solar-powered equipment that doesn't rely on fossil fuels." End quote. "And you need farmers to test all this. We need farmers who understand both the old ways and the necessity of new ones. Farmers who won't resist change, but will help shape it." She paused. "Farmers like you." James looked out at his failing fields again. "If I say yes, what happens next?" "I'll come back out to the farm this afternoon. We'll sign the initial paperwork, and I'll take the drone back. By the end of the week, our team will begin installing the first phase of equipment. You'll need to document everything's successes, failures, suggestions for improvement." End quote. It sounded straightforward enough. "And if it doesn't work out?" "The contract includes a generous severance clause," Olivia said. "But I don't think we'll need it." James took a deep breath. "All right, I'm in." "Excellent. I'll see you at 2 o'clock." Olivia hung up without saying goodbye. James sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, his coffee growing cold, wondering if he'd just saved his farm or made the biggest mistake of his life. At precisely 2 o'clock, the black sedan returned to the farm. This time, Olivia wasn't alone. A man in his 60s stepped out of the passenger side, tall and distinguished with piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Richard Blackwood. James had seen him in news articles and on television, but those images hadn't captured the sheer presence of the man. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never known failure, who had built an empire through sheer force of will. "Mr. Harper," Richard said, extending his hand. "I wanted to meet you in person before we finalized our arrangement." James shook his hand, conscious again of the calluses on his palms, the roughness that marked him as a man who worked with his hands. "I appreciate that, Mr. Blackwood. Richard, please." The billionaire looked past James at the farmhouse, the fields beyond. "My father was a farmer, did you know that? Not nearly as successful as your family has been, but he understood the land." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I didn't know that." "It's not in the official biography," Richard acknowledged with a small smile. "Humble beginnings don't make for inspiring business stories. But I've never forgotten what he taught me about hard work and respect for the earth." Olivia stepped forward. "I've brought the contract, James, if you'd like to review it." James nodded, and the three of them moved toward the house. Inside, the contrast between the Blackwood's polished appearance and his modest home was almost uncomfortable. The farmhouse had been built in the 1920s and updated sporadically since then. The kitchen where they sat still had the linoleum his mother had installed in the 90s. If the Blackwoods noticed or cared about the humble surroundings, they didn't show it. Richard accepted a cup of coffee and studied James over the rim, while Olivia laid out the contract on the kitchen table. "The terms are as we discussed," Olivia said, pointing to key sections as she explained. 1-year initial contract, renewal option, confidentiality clauses, compensation details here, and the Sienna. Implementation schedule for the farm starts here. James read through the document carefully, asking questions when he didn't understand the legal terminology. Richard watched this process with apparent approval. "You're thorough," he commented when James finally reached for a pen. "That's good. We need people who read the fine print." James signed where indicated, then pushed the contract across to Olivia. "So what happens now?" Richard set down his coffee cup. "Now, we begin transforming your farm into a model for the future of agriculture. The first equipment will arrive tomorrow. Within a month, you'll start seeing results. Within a year, if our projections are correct, this farm will be producing record yields despite the drought conditions." "That's ambitious," James said, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. "Ambition is what built Blackwood Tech," Richard replied. "But so did realism. We're not promising miracles, Mr. Harper. We're offering technology and expertise. The rest will come from your knowledge of this land and your willingness to adapt." James nodded slowly. "I understand. Do you?" Richard leaned forward, his intense gaze fixed on James. "Because once we start, there's no going back to the old ways. Change is rarely comfortable, especially for those with deep roots." There was something in the way he said it that made James think Richard wasn't just talking about farming techniques. "I know what's at stake," he said quietly. "This land has been in my family for generations, but it won't stay that way if I can't adapt to new conditions." Richard sat back, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Well put." He turned to Olivia. "I believe Mr. Harper and I understand each other." Olivia gathered the signed contract, tucking it into a leather portfolio. "There's one more thing, James. The drone." "Right." James led them to the workshop where the repaired drone sat on the workbench. "I wasn't able to fully test the electronics, but the physical damage is fixed." Richard approached the drone, examining James's handiwork with an expert eye. "Impressive. Most people wouldn't have been able to repair carbon fiber this cleanly without specialized tools." "I've had lots of practice making do with what I have," James said. "That's a valuable skill," Richard picked up the drone carefully. "Olivia tells me you realized there was a backup camera." James nodded. "Last night, I saw the indicator light, and yet you continued with the repairs, knowing you were being watched. The drone needed fixing, whether I was being watched or not." Richard smiled slightly, a practical perspective. He handed the drone to Olivia, who placed it in a specialized case she'd brought from the car. "We'll leave you to your work now, Mr. Harper. The team will be in touch tomorrow about the equipment installation." And, as they prepared to leave, Richard paused at the workshop door. "One more question, if you don't mind. When you found the drone, What was your first thought? James considered the question carefully. I wondered what it was doing here, so far from anywhere else. Not how much it might be worth, not whether you could keep it. No, James said simply, just curiosity. Richard nodded, as if this confirmed something important. Curiosity is the foundation of innovation, Mr. Harper. Remember that in the days ahead. With that cryptic statement, the Blackwoods departed, leaving James standing in the workshop, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. The next morning, a convoy of trucks arrived at the farm, carrying equipment James had only read about in agricultural journals: solar-powered irrigation systems, soil sensors, weather stations, and more drones. Similar to the one he'd repaired but apparently designed for field work rather than testing. A team of technicians swarmed over the property, led by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Chen, Blackwood Tech's head of SES. Agricultural Innovation. Mr. Harper, she said, shaking his hand firmly. Olivia briefed me on your situation. We'll start with the southeastern fields, installing the irrigation system and sensors. We should have the first phase operational within 3 days. James blinked at the speed with which everything was happening. Don't you need to survey the land first? Test the soil? Dr. Chen smiled. We did that last week with satellite imagery. And we've been pulling soil samples for months through our regular drone flights over drought-affected areas. You've been watching this farm for months? Not you specifically, Dr. Chen clarified. We've been monitoring hundreds of farms across the region, gathering data on drought impacts. Your property happens to be an ideal test case: right size, diverse terrain, severe drought conditions. James wasn't sure whether to be relieved or concerned that his farm had been under surveillance long before he found the drone. So what's the plan? Dr. Chen unfolded a tablet and showed him a detailed map of his property, overlaid with colored zones and annotations. We'll divide the farm into test quadrants. Each will receive slightly different treatment so we can compare results. Your job will be to monitor daily, record observations, and report any issues immediately. She handed him an advanced smartphone. This will connect you directly to our system. You'll receive alerts, submit reports, and view real-time data through a specialized app. James turned the phone over in his hands. It was sleeker and more sophisticated than anything he'd ever owned. This is a lot of technology for one farmer to manage. You won't be alone, Dr. Chen assured him. I'll be back weekly to check progress, and there's a support team available 24/7 through the app. Besides, Olivia seemed confident you'd adapt quickly. James looked up in surprise. Olivia sent that? Dr. Chen's expression was knowing. Ms. Blackwood doesn't recommend people for this program lightly. She must have seen something special in you. Before James could respond, a technician called Dr. Chen away to consult on the irrigation installation. James was left standing in his yard, watching as strangers swarmed over his property, transforming it with technology that seemed almost alien compared to the equipment he was used to. By the end of the day, the first quadrant of his farm had been completely revamped. Solar panels powered new irrigation systems that delivered water directly to plant roots in precisely calculated amounts. Sensors protruded from the soil at regular intervals, sending data continuously to a central hub. Drones were programmed to fly regular patterns over the fields, monitoring for pests, disease, and water stress. As the sun set, James sat on his porch, exhausted from trying to absorb so much new information. The farm hadn't seen this much activity in years, and the quiet he'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by the hum of equipment and the occasional beep of sensors initializing. His phone, the new one from Blackwood Tech, chimed with a message. It was from Olivia. How was day one? James stared at the screen, unsure how to summarize the whirlwind of activity. Finally he typed, overwhelming. 3 dots appeared immediately, indicating she was typing a response. That's normal. It gets easier. The data should start coming in tomorrow. James hesitated, then added, Your father said something about his father being a farmer. Is that true? This time, the pause before her response was longer. Yes, he doesn't talk about it much, but my grandfather had a small farm in Nebraska. Lost it during a drought in the '70s. That's why he's so committed to this project. The personal connection surprised James. It made the Blackwoods seem more human, less like the distant billionaires of magazine articles and television interviews. "Why didn't you tell me that when you were trying to convince me to sign on?" he asked. Another pause. "Because I wanted you to make the decision based on what was best for your farm, not because you felt some kind of personal connection to my family's history." It was a straightforward answer, practical rather than emotional. James was beginning to understand that this was Olivia's way: direct, efficient, focused on results rather than sentiment. "Fair enough," he replied. "The technicians say the first data should come in tomorrow." "Good, I'll check in then." The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving James with more questions than answers about the enigmatic woman who had crashed into his life via a broken drone. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Each day brought new equipment, new procedures to learn, new data to analyze. James found himself working longer hours than he had in years, but the work was different, less physically demanding, more intellectually challenging. He discovered that he enjoyed the technical aspects of the project, the problem-solving, the constant innovation. The smartphone became an extension of his hand, always providing information, always collecting his observations. Dr. Chen visited weekly as promised, making adjustments to the systems based on the data and James's feedback. She seemed genuinely interested in his observations, often implementing his suggestions immediately. "You have good instincts," she told him one day as they walked the fields together. "Most farmers we work with resist the technology at first, insist on doing things the old way." "The old way wasn't working anymore," James said simply. "No point clinging to methods that can't handle the new climate reality." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the attitude we're looking for. Realistic but not fatalistic. Willing to adapt without abandoning core agricultural principles." As May turned to June, the first quadrant of the farm began to show remarkable results. The corn was growing despite the continuing drought, the new irrigation system delivering precisely the amount of water needed directly to the roots, while the soil sensors monitored moisture levels and adjusted brine automatically. James sent daily reports through the app, documenting the growth, the soil conditions, the efficiency of the irrigation system. Sometimes Olivia would respond with questions or suggestions, but more often, the feedback came from Dr. Chen or other members of the technical team. He tried not to feel disappointed by Olivia's limited involvement. After all, this was a business arrangement, not a personal one. She was likely busy with other aspects of Blackwood Tech's operations, other projects, other farmers. Then, one evening in late June, the black sedan appeared on the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. James was in the fields, checking soil sensors, when he spotted it. By the time he reached the house, Olivia was already waiting on the porch. "Surprise inspection?" he asked as he approached. She smiled, and he noticed she was dressed more casually than before, in jeans and a simple white shirt, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "More like a curiosity visit. I wanted to see the progress for myself." "You could have just checked the data," James pointed out. "I know everything gets uploaded to your headquarters automatically." "Data doesn't tell the whole story," Olivia said. "I wanted to see it with my own eyes, hear your perspective directly." James gestured toward the fields. "Would you like a tour?" Olivia nodded, and they set off across the property. James found himself speaking more animatedly than he had in years, explaining the changes, the adjustments they'd made to the irrigation system, the unexpected benefits they'd discovered. "The soil sensors showed us that we'd been overwatering some areas and underwatering others for years," he explained as they walked between rows of corn that were now knee-high and vibrant green. "The new system targets exactly where the water is needed most. We're using 40% less water than last year, and the crops are healthier." Olivia listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed a deeper understanding of agriculture than James had initially credited her with. "You sound like you're enjoying this," she observed. James considered this. "I am," he admitted. "It's not what I expected farming to be when I took over from my father, but it's still farming. Just farming with better tools." They reached the edge of the property where a new weather station had been installed the previous week. From this vantage point, they could see the entire farm, the clear division between the quadrants where different systems were being tested. "What did your father think about new technology?" Olivia asked. James leaned against the weather station's support pole. He was cautious, not against it entirely, but skeptical. He believed in the old ways because they'd worked for him and his father before him. And if he could see the farm now? James looked out over the fields, considering. He'd probably be shocked at first. All these sensors and drones. It's a far cry from the farming he knew. He paused. But I think he'd come around once he saw the results. He was practical above all else. If something worked, he was willing to accept it. Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. My father is the opposite. He's always pushing for the new, the innovative, sometimes before the world is ready for it. Is that why you're different? James asked before he could stop himself. More measured? More cautious? Olivia looked surprised by the observation. You think I'm cautious? I think you're thorough, James clarified. You don't jump to conclusions. You gather data, you observe, you test. She smiled slightly. That's a diplomatic way of saying, I'm not as bold as my father. Bold isn't always better, James said. Especially when you're dealing with something as fundamental as food production. Olivia studied him for a moment, then looked out at the fields again. You're right, of course. Agriculture isn't software. You can't just release an update if there's a bug. Mistakes have real consequences. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Finally, Olivia spoke again. Do you ever wonder why we chose your farm? Why we sent that drone specifically over your property? James had wondered, of course, but he'd assumed it was as Dr. Chen had said his farm was the right size in the right location with the right problems. Are you saying it wasn't random? He asked. Olivia hesitated, then shook her head. Not entirely. We were looking at several farms in the region, all facing similar challenges, but there was a more personal reason as well. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, aged and worn at the edges. She handed it to James. The photo showed two men standing in front of a cornfield, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was clearly a younger version of Richard Blackwood. The other, that's my father, James said in disbelief, staring at the familiar face. How? They were roommates in college, Olivia explained. Before my father dropped out to start his first company. They kept in touch for years afterward. When my grandfather lost his farm, your father offered advice, support. My father never forgot that. James stared at the photograph, memories realigning in his mind. He never mentioned knowing Richard Blackwood. From what my father tells me, yours wasn't one to brag about his connections, Olivia said. And once Blackwood Tech took off, they lost touch. My father regrets that now. So, this whole project? No, Olivia said firmly. The agricultural initiative is genuine. We're working with dozens of farms across the country. But when we were selecting candidates in this region, your name came up, and my father recognized it. She took the photograph back, tucking it carefully into her pocket. The drone test was still real. We do that with all potential partners. But I won't pretend there wasn't a hope that you would pass, that we could help. James wasn't sure how to feel about this revelation. Part of him was touched by the connection, the idea that his father's friendship had created this opportunity. Another part felt manipulated, as if his participation had been engineered from the start. Why tell me this now? He asked. Olivia looked directly at him, her expression open in a way it hadn't been before. Because the initial data from your farm is exceeding our projections by 30%. Because you've taken to the technology faster than any other farmer in the program. Because... She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. Because I think we're moving from a test phase to a true partnership, and partnerships should be built on honesty. James nodded slowly, absorbing this. I appreciate that. They began walking back toward the farmhouse, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. The crops that had been withering just a month ago now stood tall and green. A testament to what was possible when old knowledge and new technology worked in harmony. What happens after the one-year contract? James asked as they approached the house. Olivia stopped, turning to face him. That depends on the results, but if things continue as they are, we'd like to expand. Make this farm a demonstration site for other farmers in the region. Train people here. Your role would shift from test subject to educator. Me? Teaching other farmers? Who better? You've lived the transition. You understand both worlds. Olivia's voice grew more animated. This technology can transform agriculture, James, but only if farmers trust it, understand it. They'll listen to one of their own, in a way they never would to tech executives from the city. The idea was both exciting and intimidating. James had never seen himself as a teacher, a leader. He'd been content to work his land. Continue the Harper tradition. But the Harper tradition had always been about adaptation, finding ways to survive in a changing world. I'd need to think about it, he said finally. Of course, Olivia agreed. It's just something to consider for the future. They reached the porch steps, and an awkward moment ensued as neither seemed sure how to end the evening. Finally, James gestured toward the house. Would you like to come in? I could make coffee. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. Inside, James busied himself with the coffee maker while Olivia wandered around the living room. Looking at the photographs on the walls, generations of Harpers standing in front of the same farmhouse, through different eras, the clothing and hairstyles changing while the land remained constant. Your family has deep roots here, she observed. James nodded as he brought 2 mugs of coffee to the living room. 4 generations. My great-grandfather built this house, after the previous one burned down in 1924. Do you ever feel burdened by that history? The expectation to continue? The question hit close to home. James had asked himself the same thing many times, especially during the worst days of the drought, when it seemed like the Harper legacy might end with him. Sometimes, he admitted, especially when things go wrong, but mostly it feels like a privilege, being part of something that's lasted so long. Olivia accepted the coffee, wrapping both hands around the mug. I never understood that kind of connection to place. Growing up, we moved every few years, new house, new city, sometimes new country. Wherever my father's business interests took us. That must have been hard, James said, settling into his father's old armchair across from her. It had advantages. I've seen more of the world than most people my age. She took a sip of coffee. But I never had what you have, a home that spans generations, a place that knows your family's story. There was something wistful in her voice that made James see her differently. Not as the confident, sometimes intimidating businesswoman, but as someone who had perhaps missed something essential in her globe-trotting childhood. It's not too late, he said quietly, to put down roots somewhere. Olivia met his eyes briefly, then looked away. Perhaps not. She set down her coffee cup. I should go. I have meetings in the city tomorrow. James walked her to her car, the night air cool on his skin after the warmth of the house. As she opened the car door, she turned back to him. Thank you for the coffee, and for being so adaptable with all this. She gestured vaguely toward the fields with their new technology. Not everyone would have embraced such dramatic change. Thank you for giving my farm a future, James replied. Whatever your reasons. Olivia smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I'll be back next month for the quarterly review. We can talk more about the demonstration site idea then, if you're interested. I'll think about it, James promised. He watched her car disappear down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, before turning back to the house. Inside, he found himself looking at the family photographs with new eyes, wondering if his father was in any of the pictures with Richard Blackwood, if there had been signs of that connection all along that he'd simply never noticed. The revelation that he hadn't been randomly selected changed things, though he wasn't yet sure how. Was it nepotism? A rich man's attempt to pay an old debt? Or something more genuine, a recognition of potential that might otherwise have been lost when the farm failed? In the end, he decided, the reason mattered less than the result. His farm was thriving for the first time in years. He was learning, growing, finding new purpose in the work. Whether it had come about through random chance or orchestrated opportunity, he was grateful. The summer progressed, and with it came remarkable changes to the farm. By July, all 4 quadrants had been equipped with Blackwood tech systems, each slightly different to test various approaches. The drought continued, but its impact was minimized by the precision irrigation, the data-driven planting schedules, the constant monitoring that allowed for immediate intervention at the first sign of stress. James found himself working closely with Dr. Chen and her team, suggesting modifications based on his knowledge of the land. Learning to interpret the data that poured in daily from the sensors and drones, he became fluent in a new language of agricultural technology, bridging the gap between the scientists and the soil. Word spread in the farming community. Neighbors who had initially been skeptical began to stop by, curious about the strange equipment. The green fields amidst the brown landscape of drought. James found himself explaining the systems, showing the results, becoming an advocate for the very changes he had once approached with caution. In August, Richard Blackwood himself returned to the farm, accompanied by a film crew and several journalists. Blackwood Tech was ready to announce its agricultural initiative publicly, and James's farm had been selected as the bee showcase. "We're calling it the Harper Protocol," Richard told him as they prepared for the press conference. "A comprehensive approach to climate-adaptive farming that combines traditional agricultural knowledge with cutting-edge technology." James was stunned. "You're naming it after me?" Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "Your family has farmed this land for generations. Now the Harper name will help farmers around the world adapt to changing conditions. I think your father would be proud." The press conference was unlike anything James had experienced before. Cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, and Richard Blackwood laid out his vision for transforming agriculture in the face of climate change. James found himself called to the microphone, asked to explain in his own words how the technology had affected Bassanao, his farm. "A year ago, I was 3 months away from losing everything," he said, looking out at the sea of faces. "The bank was calling, the crops were failing, and the drought showed no signs of breaking. Today, my farm is producing record yields with 40% less water. The soil is healthier than it's been in a decade. And I'm not just surviving, I'm planning for the future." A journalist raised her hand. "Mr. Harper, critics suggest that partnerships like this give too much control to tech companies and take autonomy away from farmers. How would you respond to that concern?" James considered the question carefully. "I understand the fear. Farming is personal. It's about connection to the land, to history, to family. But climate change is real, and it's changing the rules. We can cling to old methods and fail, or we can adapt and survive." He gestured toward the fields visible through the barn doors. "Every decision about this farm is still mine. The technology provides information, options, efficiency, but the farmer's knowledge, the farmer's judgment, is still essential. This isn't about replacing farmers. It's about giving us the tools to keep farming in a changing world." The answer seemed to satisfy the journalist, and the questions moved on to technical details about the systems, implementation costs, scalability for smaller farms. Through it all, James was struck by Richard's deference to his practical experience. The way the billionaire repeatedly directed questions about on-the-ground implementation to him, rather than the technical team. After the press conference, as the journalists and film crew packed up their equipment, Richard Datchgrass took James aside. "You handled that well," he said. "Better than most of our scientists would have. People trust you, they can see you're authentic." "I just told the truth," James said with a shrug. "Exactly." Richard looked out at the fields. "The next phase will involve expanding this approach to other farms in the region. We'd like you to lead that effort, be the bridge between our technical team and the farming community." Olivia mentioned something about that. James acknowledged. "A demonstration site, training program." "More than that," Richard said. "We're establishing a Blackwood Agricultural Center here in the county. Research, development, training, community outreach. We'd like you to head it." James stared at him. "Me? I don't have the qualifications for something like that." "You have exactly the qualifications we need," Richard insisted. "Scientific expertise we can hire. What we can't hire is your credibility, your connection to this community, your ability to translate between our world and theirs." It was a stunning offer, far beyond anything James had imagined when he'd signed that initial contract. "I'd need to think about it," he said. Richard nodded. "Of course. Discuss it with Olivia when she returns. She'll be overseeing the center's development." "Olivia is coming back?" James tried to keep his tone neutral, but something in Richard's expression suggested he hadn't entirely succeeded. "Next week," Richard confirmed, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "She's been quite involved in this particular project, more hands-on than usual." Before James could respond to that loaded observation, Richard was called away to speak with a journalist who had additional questions. James was left standing alone, processing not just the job offer but the implication in Richard's tone about Olivia's interest in the projector, perhaps in the farmer running it. The week that followed was busy with cleanup from the press event and continued monitoring of the systems. The publicity had brought a steady stream of visitors to the farm, local officials, neighboring farmers, agricultural students from the state university. James found himself giving impromptu tours, explaining the technology, sharing the data that showed the dramatic improvements in yield and resource efficiency. He was in the middle of one such tour when a familiar black sedan appeared on the horizon. His heart beat a little faster at the sight, though he tried to tell himself it was just anticipation of discussing the job offer with Olivia. Nothing more personal than that. He finished the tour quickly, sending the visitors on their way, just as Olivia pulled up to the farmhouse. She stepped out of the car, dressed more formally than on her last visit in a tailored blazer and slim pants, her hair pulled back in its usual practical ponytail. "I hear you've become quite the celebrity," she said by way of greeting, nodding toward the departing cars of the tour group. James shook his head. "Just a lot of curious people." "Your father's press conference stirred up interest. Did he talk to you about the agricultural center?" "He did." James gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to sit?" "It's been a long day of talking." They settled into the rocking chairs that had been on the Harper farm porch for as long as James could remember. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light over the fields, the crops swaying gently in the breeze. "What do you think about the offer?" Olivia asked, getting straight to the point as usual. James rocked slowly, organizing his thoughts. "It's a huge opportunity. Bigger than anything I ever imagined for myself. But I'm a farmer, not a director of a research center. I don't have the education, the credentials." Olivia shook her head. "You have something more valuable, the respect of the farming community. You can open doors that would remain closed to us otherwise." "And my farm? Who would manage it while I'm running this center?" "It would become part of the center," Olivia explained. "A living laboratory, demonstration site, and working farm all in one. You'd still make the key decisions, but with a team to help implement them." James considered this. The idea was appealing, maintaining his connection to the land while taking on a new challenge, helping other farmers adapt to the changing climate. "Your father said you'd be overseeing the center's development," he said finally. "Would that mean you'd be here more often?" The question was more personal than he'd intended, and for a moment, Olivia looked surprised. Then her expression softened slightly. "For the first year, yes. I'd be here at least 2 weeks out of every month, establishing the programs, building the team." She hesitated. Would that be a point in favor of accepting the position? It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging the current that had been building beneath their professional interactions, a connection that went beyond farmer and technology executive, beyond project partners. "It might be," James admitted, deciding honesty was the best approach. "I've enjoyed working with you, learning from you." Olivia looked out at the fields, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The learning has been mutual, I assure you." After a moment, she turned back to him. "There's another aspect to this offer that my father probably didn't mention." "What's that?" "The center would include a substantial ownership stake for you. 20% equity in the operation, in addition to your salary as director." James stared at her. That's extremely generous." "It's practical," Olivia countered. "We need you invested in the success of this venture, committed for the long term, and it acknowledges that we're building on your expertise, your relationship with the land and the community." The offer was transformative. 20% of what would likely be a multi-million-dollar operation, plus a director's salary, would secure his financial future in a way farming alone never could have. It would mean the Harper legacy could continue, albeit in a different form than his ancestors might have imagined. "I'd want to be sure the technology remains accessible to smaller farms," he said. "Not just large operations that can afford expensive systems." Olivia nodded. "That's already built into the plan. Sliding scale pricing, cooperative purchasing options for smaller farms, grants for historically disadvantaged farmers. It's all in the proposal." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. "The full details are here, when you're ready to review them." James accepted the folder. "Thank you. I'll read it tonight." "No rush," Olivia said. "We're not expecting an answer immediately. Take time to consider what this would mean for you, for your legacy." She stood, smoothing her blazer. "I should let you get to it. I'm staying in town for the next few days, if you have questions." As she turned to leave, James spoke up. "Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night, to discuss the proposal?" Olivia paused, then turned back to face him. "Is that the only reason?" Her direct question deserved a direct answer. "No," James said simply. "Not the only reason." The smile that spread across her face transformed her features, softening the businesslike exterior she typically presented to the world. "Then yes, I'd like that very much." That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with the proposal spread out before him, reading every page carefully as the night deepened around the farmhouse. The more he read, the more impressed he was by the vision not just for his farm or even for the region, but for agriculture globally. The Blackwood Agricultural Center would be a model, with similar centers planned for drought-affected regions around the world. His role would be central to the entire enterprise, bringing the farmer's perspective to what might otherwise become a purely technological approach. His practical knowledge would inform the research, the development, the training programs. His farm would be the proving ground for innovations that could help farmers everywhere adapt to changing climate conditions. By the time he finished reading, well past midnight, his decision was made. The Harper legacy wouldn't end with him. It would evolve, expand, become part of something that could help preserve family farming for generations to come. The next morning, he called Olivia to confirm their dinner plans and to let her know he'd read the proposal. "I have some questions," he told her, "but overall, I'm impressed." "Good," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I'll pick you up at 7. The day passed in a blur of activity, routine farm work, a visit from Dr. Chen to check on one of the irrigation systems, preparation for the evening ahead. By the time 7 o'clock approached, James found himself more nervous than he'd been for the press conference, changing his shirt twice before settling on a simple button-down that had been his go-to for rare special bowl occasions over the years. When Olivia arrived, she too seemed to have put thought into the evening, wearing a simple dress rather than her usual business attire, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The transformation was subtle but striking. "I thought we could go to Riverside Inn," she suggested as he joined her in the car. "I hear they have excellent food, and it's quiet enough for a real conversation." The restaurant was the nicest in the county, housed in a historic building overlooking the river that gave the town its name. As they were seated at a corner table with a view of the water, James couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since he'd found that broken drone in his field just a few months ago. Over dinner, they discussed the proposal in detail, his questions, her clarifications, the timeline for developing the center. But as the meal progressed, the conversation shifted, becoming more personal, more relaxed. Olivia told him about growing up as the daughter of a famous innovator, the pressure and privilege it entailed. "People always expected me to be like him, visionary, charismatic, larger than life. But I'm not wired that way. I'm more methodical, more detail-oriented." "More grounded," James suggested. "That's not a bad thing, especially when you're working with farmers." She smiled appreciatively. "That's a nice way to put it. My father sees possibilities everywhere. I see the steps needed to make those possibilities real." "You complement each other," James observed. "Like the technology and farming, different approaches that work better together than apart." The analogy seemed to please her. "Exactly. Though I'll admit, this project has changed me somewhat. I'm starting to see the appeal of being more connected to the land, to concrete results you can see and touch. And I've gained an appreciation for data, for measuring what once seemed unmeasurable, James acknowledged. For thinking beyond this season to the bigger picture. They continued talking long after the meal was finished, reluctant to end the evening. Finally, as the restaurant began to empty around them, Olivia asked the question that had been hovering between them all night. "Have you decided about the position?" James nodded. "I'm going to accept, with one condition." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "That we find a way to preserve the historic character of the farmhouse and barn," he said. "They're part of the Harper legacy, as important as the land itself." Relief and pleasure crossed Olivia's face. "That's absolutely doable. In fact, I was thinking the farmhouse would make an ideal welcome center for visitors, a place to showcase the contrast between traditional farming and the new approaches." "Then we have a deal," James said, extending his hand across the table. Olivia took it, but instead of shaking it, she held it for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Here's to the future of farming," she said softly. "And to unexpected drones," James added with a smile. The drive back to the farm was quiet, a comfortable silence between two people who had found common ground despite their different backgrounds. When they reached the farmhouse, James invited her in for coffee, and they ended up sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky, talking about everything and nothing. It was nearly midnight when Olivia finally rose to leave. At the steps of the porch, she turned back to him. "You know, when I set up that drone test months ago, I never imagined it would lead here," she said. "I was just following protocol, looking for the right partner for the agricultural initiative." "And did you find what you were looking for?" James asked, standing close enough to notice the faint scent of her perfume. "I found more," she admitted, her voice soft in the darkness. "I found someone who made me see my father's work, and my own in a new light. Someone who reminded me that innovation isn't just about technology, it's about people, about connection to place and purpose." James took a step closer. "And I found someone who showed me that change doesn't have to mean losing what matters most. Sometimes it means finding new ways to honor old values." The moment hung between them, full of possibility. Then, with a courage born of months of drought and years of solitude, James leaned forward and kissed her gently. Olivia responded immediately, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders as the kiss deepened, became something more than either had planned, but both had wanted. When they finally pulled apart, Olivia's smile was visible even in the darkness. "I think this partnership is going to work out well," she murmured. "I think so too," James agreed, taking her hand in his. "Though your father might have some opinions about it." Olivia laughed softly. "My father has opinions about everything, but in this case, I suspect he saw the possibility before either of us did." The drone test, James realized. It wasn't just about finding a partner for the project, was it? "Let's just say he's been trying to find someone who could keep up with me for years," Olivia admitted. "Someone who values both innovation and tradition, who understands that the future must be built on respect for the past. Someone who would fix a broken drone instead of selling it," James suggested. "Exactly." She squeezed his hand. "Though I still maintain the agricultural benefits were the primary goal." "Of course," James agreed with a smile. "The personal connection is just a bonus." "A significant bonus," Olivia corrected, leaning in for another kiss. As they stood there under the stars that had watched over the Harper farm for generations, James thought about the strange path that had led to this moment. A drought, a broken drone, a test he hadn't known he was taking. What had seemed like the end of his family's legacy was becoming instead a new beginning, the chance to honor the past while embracing a future he could never have imagined. The Harper farm would continue, transformed but unbroken, its roots deeper than ever in the soil of innovation and tradition. And James Harper, like the generations before him, had found a way to adapt, to grow, to thrive in changing conditions with a partner he never expected, but now couldn't imagine being without. In the fields beyond the farmhouse, The crops swayed gently in the night breeze, nourished by technology and tended with knowledge passed down through generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new growth. But for tonight, on this porch where Harper's had stood for nearly a century, the future looked as bright as the stars overhead. The broken drone that had started it all was long since repaired and returned to Blackwood Tech. But its work was done. It had brought together two worlds, two perspectives, two people who might never have met otherwise. In testing James Harper, it had revealed not just his character, but a path forward for his farm, for agriculture, and for his heart. Sometimes, James reflected, as he walked Olivia back to her car for a final good night, the most important repairs aren't made to machines at all, but to hopes, to dreams, to the belief that even in the hardest times, something new and unexpected can take root and flourish. "I'll see you tomorrow," Olivia promised as she got into her car. "We have a center to plan." "And a future," James added. "That too," she agreed with a smile. "That too." As her car disappeared down the long driveway, James looked out over his farm, not just his anymore, but a bridge between past and future, between tradition and innovation. The drought continued, but its power to threaten was diminished. The Harper legacy would continue, not despite change, but because of it. And it all began with a broken drone, falling from the sky onto land that was ready for transformation.